Chapter 1141. Yorick kept silent. Nolan chuckled and said, I have to say you're good at pretending. For the Persian Gulf project, why don't you? You're so annoying. Yorick interrupted as he turned around to look at Nolan. His face was drenched cold as he frowned annoyingly. Nolan walked into the ward and sat down on a chair. I didn't expect that the womanizer Mr. Hathaway would end up like this, for a woman. Yorick leaned against the window. His heart was so cold that he couldn't feel the coldness seeping into him from the cold rain. Ridiculous, isn't it? I also find it ridiculous. He said, it's ridiculous that I would let a woman into my heart after only knowing her for 3 months, right? She isn't very pretty either. Although I have to admit that she has a nice body shape, she has a nasty personality. She may look smart on the surface, but she's just a naive and innocent girl, deep down. While playing with his watch, Nolan lifted his head to look at Yorick, but didn't say anything. He set his gaze on the world outside the window, and his eyes were dull. I care for her because she's as innocent as Sharon. Initially, I was just teasing her. He came to an abrupt stop before he could finish his sentence. Yorick took a deep breath and tapped on the windowsill in a regular tempo. Water droplets dripped from the corners of his eyes, but no one could tell whether they were raindrops or tears. Nolan slowly rose to his feet and asked. The daughter of the Nixes is dead. Do you know about that? Yorick was stunned. He lowered his head without saying anything, his expression calm and cold. Meanwhile, the Nixes had come to the St. Donner estate to confront the Hathaway. The man standing in the front of the group was Mandy's father. His face was stern as he looked at Madame Hathaway, who was sipping on her tea. What do you mean by this? Holding her teacup, Madame Hathaway smiled at him and replied, I'm sure I've made myself pretty clear. Ms. Nix's death has nothing to do with Yorick. What's more, what does what Ms. Nix has done or who she has offended have anything to do with the Hathaway? Mr. Nix smacked the table and snarled, yes, Mandy harmed Yorick's woman. But who knows whether Yorick has or hasn't taken revenge on Mandy for that woman. Madame Hathaway scoffed coldly. Although she was old, she was still as confident and calm as she used to be when she was young. Mr. Nix, I'm sure you yourself know very well how many enemies your Nix family made when you started to work with the underworld. Master Nix set his jaw tightly and frowned. Madame Hathaway slammed her teacup on the table and replied confidently, if Yorick wanted to avenge that woman, he would have done it himself a long time ago. Yorick was injured because of this incident as well. If those people were his men, would they hurt their own master? What would they get for doing that? Mr. Nix clenched his fists tightly. Madame Hathaway glared at Master Nix and said sternly, Mr. Nix, if you want to be unreasonable, then the Hathaway won't be reasonable to you either. The choice is yours, Mr. Nix. You can choose to end this in a peaceful way or a rough way. Mr. Nix harumphed and went away with his men. Holding Zyla's luggage, Maisie came to a farm in the suburbs with a cab. The air was filled with the scent of mud after rain. There were many chained cows on the grassland, and the endless aspen trees and grass made this place look like a paradise. At that moment, a middle-aged man in a denim jacket with a bearded cheek walked out of the warehouse with a cigarette in his mouth and grains in his hands. Maisie approached him with the luggage and asked, Hi, I'm sorry, but may I know if the girl you saved is here? The bearded man put the grains down and took a drag from his cigarette. He turned his head around to study Maisie and asked expressionlessly, You're her friend? Chapter 1142. Yes. Maisie nodded. Maisie. Zyla was standing in front of the door. She was wearing a dress from the man's daughter. Although it did not go very well with her body size, she still looked rather good in it. Zyla came forward and said to the bearded man, I'm sorry, Mr. Sullivan. She's my friend. Sullivan nodded. Then, he went away to do his own stuff with his cigarette in between his lips. Zyla pulled Maisie into the house. Although the house was not as luxurious and spacious as those rooms in the mansion, it was clean. There was a young boy and an old woman in the house other than them. "Hi," Maisie greeted them, and the boy waved his hand back at her shyly. However, the old woman did not give Maisie any response, as if she did not get what she said. Zyla came forward and said, "She's Mr. Sullivan's mother. She's deaf." Maisie was stunned. Something crossed her head, and she turned around to look at her. "Yorick thought you're dead. Can you tell me what happened?" Zyla was stumped for a moment before she lowered her head. "Do you know Miss Nix, Yorick's fiancée? She abducted me and wanted to humiliate me. I thought I was going to die as well." She sat on the couch and ran her finger across the wound on her shoulder that had been treated. "Mr. Sullivan saved me. The Nixes had ties with the underworld, and Sullivan had worked for the mafia when he was young. The Nixes had killed his daughter when she was 18. Mandy had been the main culprit. Sullivan's daughter had been studying in the same school as Mandy. Sullivan's daughter had offended Mandy, so the latter arranged for her to receive Zyla's treatment. She had found someone to violate Sullivan's daughter, and an accident happened. Sullivan's daughter ended up dead, so Mandy made it look like she had killed herself. Sullivan could not believe that his daughter had killed herself, so he looked into the matter himself. In the end, all the evidence pointed to the Nixes, but the local police dared not to take any action. After all, the Nixes had a lot of influence in the area, and they were connected to the underworld, so the police didn't want to get themselves into trouble. Since nobody wanted to help Sullivan, he had no other choice but to swallow his humiliation and become a bodyguard for the Nixes while looking for a chance to avenge his daughter. When Mandy abducted Zyla, Sullivan was there, just as she had been under the impression she was a goner. Sullivan suddenly attacked Mandy. Zyla rubbed her forehead and said, "I just remember Mr. Sullivan threw a jacket at me so that I could put it on. He asked me to get a cab and go to the address he gave me. I was scared and didn't want to return to the hotel, so I came here. Mr. Sullivan's mother took care of me. She treated my wound and gave her granddaughter's dress for me to put on." Zyla still couldn't help but shudder when she thought about that scene. Maisie grabbed her hand and asked, "Are you not going to tell Yorick that you're still alive?" Zyla lifted her head to look at Maisie. She fell silent for a few seconds before averting her gaze. "It was his fiancée and mother that put me in my current situation. I won't have an easy life if I stay in Yarramore, since he has already let me go. I should just leave. He's been hospitalized." Maisie looked at her, the corner of her lips curving up a little. "He was ambushed when he went to save you. He thought you're dead, and he's heartbroken." Zyla was stunned. "He's heartbroken?" Maisie nodded. "I heard that he's having some kind of mental issue. It seems like your death has hit him pretty hard." She looked at Zyla, who kept her head low in silence, and added, "Maybe he really does care for you." When Maisie returned downtown, Nolan was waiting for her in the hotel. After entering the room, the first thing that welcomed her gaze was his back. He was standing in front of the ceiling-to-floor window. She went forward and hugged him from behind. "Honey, are you done with your affairs?" Nolan grabbed her wrist, turned around, and secured her in his arms. "You went to see Zyla, right?" Chapter 1143. Maisie was stunned. She lifted her head and looked at him with a smile on her face. "How did you know?" Nolan scratched the tip of her nose and said, "I knew it from the moment we found out that dead body was Mandy." Maisie lowered her head but did not say anything. She guessed Sullivan wanted to avenge his daughter, so he had treated Mandy the same way she had treated his daughter to get back at her. "The Nixes won't let it go, will they?" she asked. Nolan chuckled. "There's nothing they can do even if they don't want to let it go. If one of their enemies killed Mandy, they wouldn't dare to make any moves since they don't know who their opponent is. Besides, do you think Yorick will let them have their way?" Maisie found a comfortable spot in his arms and played with the button on his shirt. "Then Yorick should know that Zyla is still alive, right?" Nolan carried her to the couch and kissed her with a gentle smile on his face. That's his business. It isn't something we should worry about. 2 days later. Zyla came to the hospital, but there was no one in the ward. She asked the nurse, "Do you know where the man who stayed here a few days ago is?" "So. You're the one Mr. Hathaway talked about." The nurse smiled as if she knew something. "Mr. Hathaway was discharged from the hospital yesterday, and he told me to give you this letter if you came here to look for him." The nurse gave a letter to Zyla. Zyla was stunned. She took over the letter, and the nurse left. She walked to the bench and took her seat. She opened up the envelope, and the letter was filled with Yurik's handwriting. "If you're reading this letter, it means you're here. If not, it means you've left Yaramore. I'm sorry. I was the one who brought you here against your will, but I couldn't protect you well. I was traumatized by Sharon's death, and my heart died after her passing. I thought I would never fall in love with any woman anymore. You're right. I was the one who approached you first. I should have put an end to all of this, but seeing how naive and innocent you are, I just couldn't help but go out of my way to get closer to you. I'm sorry. I didn't want to admit that you indeed have attracted me, so I could only keep on denying myself in an extreme way. However, when I thought the person who died was you, I have to confess that I have fallen for you. But the person who made you suffer all this harm is me, so I won't stop you from leaving if you want. Whether you read this letter or not, I hope you will have forgotten everything about me if you live a happy life. I don't want to become an obstacle to your pursuit of a happy life. If you're leading an unhappy life, don't forget that someone is waiting for you in a distant foreign country." When she saw the word Yurik in the bottom left corner of the letter, a drop of tear blurred the word. Zyla lifted her head, and her eyes were around the rims. She tried to hold back her tears, but to no avail. She covered her mouth with her hand and let out a laugh. Then, she broke down, and tears fell out of her eyes like broken beads, blurring the paper she had crumpled. Soon, Zyla came out of the hospital and put on her sunglasses. She stood in front of the entrance for a while, calmed herself down, flagged a cab, and went away. Nolan and Maisie were having a meal in the restaurant. She rested her chin on her hand, looked toward the outside through the window, and sighed. "Do you think Zyla will go to see Yurik?" Nolan chuckled. Gripping the foot of the glass, he shook it slightly and said, "Unless she has a thing for Yurik too." Maisie picked up the knife and cut the steak. "You're right. If Zyla doesn't have a thing for Yurik, she will probably not go to see him." Nolan took a sip of wine and lifted his brow. Who knows? At that moment, Maisie received a text message on her phone. After reading the message, she sighed. "Just like we expected. Zyla has returned home." Chapter 1144. Nolan lowered his head and laughed. "Well, we should let them handle their own stuff." 1 week after Zyla returned to Zlokovia, she received an invitation to a talk show. Everyone knew that the host of the show was a bold one to ask anything. She even asked about her scandal with Yurik in front of the audience. When the camera focused on Zyla, she fell silent for a few seconds before answering with a smile, "The scandal is real." The host was stunned. "Really?" Zyla maintained a smile on her face. "Yes. It's just that the relationship between Mr. Hathaway and me is rather complicated, so I decided not to tell anyone about it." The host chuckled and continued. "You really are very honest, Zyla." Then, she followed up with a question. "So, can you tell us what kind of relationship you and Mr. Hathaway are in right now?" Zyla played with her tassel earrings. She had put on light makeup and was wearing a frost green halter dress. She looked pretty and gave off an elegant aura. "Right now?" She looked toward the camera and said, "If Mr. Hathaway is watching this program overseas at this moment, I have something to say to him." Both the cameraman and the host were stunned. The good thing was that the host came to her senses quickly and said, "So you have something to say to Mr. Hathaway on our show today? Well then, let's hear what you have to say. I'm sure everyone is interested." Zyla lifted her brows and smiled. Then, her expression turned serious as she spoke. Yorick, we've never had a relationship because it never started. Therefore, my return to my country doesn't count as breaking up. Right now, all you have to do is wait for me. I won't give you a chance to regret it because I'm going to win your heart from today onward. #Zyla announces that she's going after Mr. Hathaway on the show. On the same day, the entire internet was filled with topics about Zyla. Netizens gave her their approval, while some complimented her for her courage. Some netizens also expressed their admiration for their love, and most of them became her fans because of her bold and straightforward personality. At Royal Crown, Mindy rushed into the office and asked, "Zyla, are you serious?" Zyla was sitting on the chair, flipping through a magazine. Without lifting her head, she said, deadly serious. "You have only been traveling abroad for a short period." Mindy said incredulously after she took a seat beside her. "It's fine if you acknowledge the scandal between you and Yorick, but how could you say that you are chasing him in front of the audience across the country? Are you not afraid he is going to reject you?" Zyla put the magazine down and said, "Well, it's not going to be the first time I get rejected." She smiled and continued. "I also had said in front of everyone that I would get Louis back to my side, but what happened in the end?" Mindy replied with a bitter smile. "You broke up." Zyla chuckled. "So I have to start a new relationship." "Zyla, have you ever thought about what if it doesn't work?" Mindy felt that Zyla had not been on a trip for a break but for brainwashing. Zyla looked at her and replied matter-of-factly. "Trust me. It'll work this time." When Zyla returned home, her parents were sitting in front of the computer, looking at something. When they saw Zyla, they hastily averted their gazes. She walked upstairs, and her mother called out to her. "Zyla." Zyla stopped in her tracks and looked at them. "Dad, Mom, I know what you want to say to me, but I have made up my mind. I won't regret it. I'm not going to talk you out of it. Besides, would you even listen to me?" Mrs. Mary Mayweather shook her head. "Someone sent a message to you." When she heard what her mother had said, Zyla rushed down the staircase and stormed up to them. "How could you two read my messages again?" Mr. Mayweather smacked his lips and replied, "We were browsing through Facebook as we don't want you to get insulted by those netizens." Then, the message came in. Chapter 1145. Zyla picked up the laptop. She looked at the screen and a message popped into her vision. "I'll be waiting for you." 1 month later, Zyla was invited to attend an event by a high-luxury brand in Yarramore. She wore a custom-made dress by Somna Star. It was a dress spotted with star rhinestones that would phase from light blue to dark blue. There was a silk scarf falling from her shoulders that swayed with her movements. She stood on the red carpet with a smile on her face and waved at the media reporters. After that, she walked with the staff to the autograph wall to put on her autograph. Suddenly, a commotion broke out in the crowd. Zyla turned her head and saw Yorick walking in her direction with the people from the brand maker. The man with broad shoulders and a narrow waist who walked in an upright position at the center was the one whom she had not seen for a whole month. Under the flashes, his features were carved to perfection, and the people beside him were pale in comparison to him. It seemed like he had changed, but it also seemed like he hadn't changed at all. When their gaze met, Zyla offered him a smile. She handed the pen over to the staff member beside her and walked past Yorick. However, no one saw that Yorick coiled his finger around. His movement was swift and light, but it caused Zyla's heart to skip a beat. Zyla continued to walk forward, but a smile was tugging on her lips. Zyla returned to the hotel, and the bell rang right after Mindy left. Zyla had already changed into the sleeping gown she had brought with her. When she opened the door, she did not even have a chance to look at the person in front of her as she was pinned to the wall while a shower of kisses rained on her. Zyla stretched her arm to coil around his neck and asked, "Didn't I ask you to wait for me, Mr. Hathaway? Or you can't wait anymore?" Yorick scooped her up from the floor and carried her to the couch. He pressed his lips on her cheek and said, "I've waited for you for a moment. I was worried that you might stand me up. She chuckled. I just asked you to wait for me. I didn't say I'm going to take a flight and come to look for you right away. He buried his head into her shoulder and laughed. Are you really going to chase after me? Zyla began to undo his buttons one by one and lifted her eyebrows to look at him. Yes, it's still not too late if you want to back out right now. Once I start to chase you, I won't accept a no as an answer anymore. Yorick pulled his tie off and kissed her. I think you're the one who will back out in the end. Zyla wrapped her arms around him. His kisses that landed on her like rain tickled the tip of her heart, making her tremble with ecstasy. The one who backed out will be a chicken. The ice and the fire finally reunited. Their blood boiled, and they fell deeper and deeper into the abyss of desire as their movements swayed along with the tempo. When Yorick announced his relationship with Zyla to the public, the internet server had an outage. After all, Yorick had been known as a womanizer. He had never admitted to the public that he was dating anyone, and this was the first time. The media from Yarramore was familiar with Zyla, and her name could be found in every corner of the internet. She was a retired supermodel, a spokesperson for numerous luxury brands, and the daughter of the director of the Royal Crown. Nobody had expected that she would be the one to take Yorick down. Yorick did not expect he would fall in love with Zyla as well. Perhaps even Zyla herself did not think that they would work out in the end. Zyla and Yorick came to the restaurant. Madame Hathaway, Nolan, and Maisie were already waiting for them inside. Holding Zyla's hand, Yorick came up to Madame Hathaway and greeted her, Aunt Hathaway. Madame Hathaway smiled and replied, "Have your seat." Zyla sat beside Maisie. This was the first time she had met Madame Hathaway. Madame Hathaway looked at Zyla with a smile on her face and said, "I heard that you're familiar with my granddaughter-in-law. This must be fate. After seeing Nolan form a family of his own, my nephew finally got himself a girlfriend. I don't have any regrets anymore, and I can die in peace." Chapter 1146. Zyla exchanged gazes with Maisie and smiled. Maybe it's just fate. Maisie supported her chin in one hand. Knowles and I were still concerned that Yorick was going to be a bachelor for the rest of his life some time ago. I really didn't expect this. Nolan scoffed. After all, he's a middle-aged man who's about to turn 37 years old this year, so there's not much time left. Yorick glared at him. You're only 3 years younger than me. Okay, just how old do the both of you think you are now? And yet, you're still quarreling with each other as if you're still kids. Z and Zyla are still here, so can you two not embarrass yourselves when they're around? Madame Hathaway might seem to be reprimanding those two men, but she had a wide grin on her face throughout the whole time. Zyla and Maisie both tried their best to hold back their laughter. Zyla. Madame Hathaway looked at her and picked up her wine glasses from the table. I would like to apologize for what Yorick's mother did to you before this. Zyla was stunned for a moment. She then got up and grabbed her wine glass in a hurry. Madame Hathaway, I actually his mother. Yuna is the daughter-in-law of the Hathaway, so I'm apologizing to you on behalf of her as well as the Hathaway. Mrs. Hathaway interrupted her. His mother has always been the one who's at fault, and I'm apologizing to you and Sharon. Zyla squeezed the foot of the glass tightly and glanced at Yorick, who was silent as if something was going through his mind. Yuna loves her son too much, and she's too selfish. She's always been afraid that her son will leave her. That's why she had been trying to get her child to live the lifestyle she wanted him to have so that he would turn into someone she likes him to be. Mrs. Hathaway sighed. What happened to Sharon is a debt that the Hathaway can never pay back to her family. However, the tragedy back then has already created an irreversible outcome, and you're lucky enough to escape the same fate this time around. So, no matter what, I must apologize to you. Since Madame Hathaway had finished her wine in one go, it was only natural for Zyla to finish all her wine too. Maisie and Nolan looked at each other and smiled. This might be the best and the luckiest outcome. Later that night, while they were on their way back after dinner, Zyla leaned on the back of the seat and was on the verge of falling asleep. and because of the alcohol that she had consumed before that, she could not even lift her eyelids. Yorick took her into his arms, and she rested her head on his shoulders. Her soft, long hair wrapped around his arms gently like silk. "Are you drunk?" Yorick pecked her forehead softly, and she felt itchy as his warm breath brushed over her skin. She nodded, stretched out her arms, and wrapped them around his waist. "Yeah, I've drunk a little too much." "Oh really?" Yorick stared down at her blushing cheeks and could not help but give off a smile through the corners of his lips. He then inserted his hand through the bottom hem of her blouse. Zyla trembled instantly, sat up straight, and pressed her body against his arm. "Yorick Hathaway." He chuckled softly. "Didn't you say that you're drunk?" Zyla ignored him and leaned back down again. She asked after a while. "You still can't let the memory that you had with Sharon, can you?" Yorick rested his chin on the top of her head and smiled. "Are you jealous of her?" She muttered, "No, Sharon is someone from my past already." Yorick stroked the dark hair that was hanging on the side of her body, pressed his palm against her cheek, and forced her to look up at him. "But you're my present, and of course, my future." Zyla suddenly thought of what he had said back then, something about her being his second woman and even his last. She smiled and kissed his lips. "You can always miss her from time to time, but I must be the only woman that you're allowed to think of in the future." Yorick laughed and rubbed her lips with the tip of his thumb. "I'll only think of you in the future as soon as you become the official Mrs. Hathaway." The dark night sky outside the window looked like the background of a dream because of the embellishment of the neon lights, and the beauty was almost ethereal. Zyla cuddled in his arms as she stared at the scenery that went by the car window in a snap of a finger and changed in a matter of a split second as if she was bidding her past self goodbye. It turned out that being in a relationship was not a one-sided thing. It would only work when both parties in the relationship had the same idea in mind. Thus, even if she had only taken one step toward the other end of the spectrum, the other party would happily take all the remaining steps just to get closer to her. Chapter 1147. A few days later, at Staslo, Riley saw in a news article of the magazine she was reading that Yorick had admitted to dating Zyla. The article also had the picture a reporter had taken for the couple. "I didn't expect that they would become a couple." Lewis, who was sitting on the side drinking his coffee, raised his eyebrows slightly. "Isn't this good news?" "Of course, it's good news. Zyla has finally found the happiness she deserves, and she won't think about you anymore." Riley supported her chin in her hand and held her smile back. Lewis almost choked on his coffee, and he put down the cup. "So, this is the thing that you're worried about?" She chuckled. "I'm only joking with you. I'm not worried about this. I was just thinking about..." Riley lowered her gaze. "She loved you so much back then and even spent 6 years of her adult life on you. She must have been very sad when the two of you broke up. And now that she found the happiness she's been looking for, she can finally walk out of that sour past. I'm so happy for her." Lewis smiled. "Yeah, I feel the same way for her too." Riley put the magazine down. She seemed to have started to feel hungry again minutes after having her last meal. She rubbed her stomach and said to Lewis, "I feel like eating again." Lewis lifted his head and looked at her. "You're sure to put on weight if you continue to eat like this." Riley was instantly upset when she heard that comment. "Are you starting to complain that I'm fat already?" "I'm not complaining." Lewis massaged his temples helplessly, got up, walked toward Riley, and rubbed the top of her head while staring at her affectionately. "I'll go and make you something to eat." Riley smiled and nodded. The next day, Riley stood on a scale to weigh herself and cried when she saw the figure that appeared on the scale. "I actually gained 10 pounds. She pinched her waist and realized that it had become even thicker than it used to be. "My slender waist is already this close to bidding me farewell forever. No wonder Lewis hasn't even touched me these few weeks. It turns out that he really dislikes the fact that I'm turning fat." Lewis Lucas. Riley rushed into the bedroom angrily, and before Lewis could get up from the bed, he was hauled out of bed and scolded. You said you weren't complaining about my weight. But I really put on a lot of weight, so tell me right now, have you been so cold to me because I've become fat and ugly? Louis propped the side of his forehead against one hand, lay on his side on the bed, and stared at her with a languid expression. What do you mean by me being cold? You don't even want to touch me now, and you're telling me that you're not complaining? Riley smacked him with a pillow. You men are all liars. Before you men get to marry the woman that you love, everything's lovey-dovey, but as soon as you get her to marry you, the woman of your life will immediately be turned into a decoration. Louis grabbed the pillow that was coming his way, pulled her into his arms, and laughed. How long has it been since your last bled? What do you mean by how long has it been since I last bled? What do you think? Louis pinched her chin, raised her face slightly, and said seriously. You're a woman. Haven't you realized that your menstrual cycle has been a few weeks late? Riley was astonished. Now that he's mentioned it, my period should have been due a long time ago, but I haven't been taking it seriously. Louis pinched her cheek. I'll do the math for you. Your period has been delayed by at least 5 weeks, you've gained weight, you're either eating or sleeping all day long, and you get agitated extremely easily. Don't all these point to the fact that you're currently pregnant? Riley looked at him in surprise. How are you so clear when it comes to this matter? He actually knows my cycle better than I do. Louis covered his face with his palm and could not help but laugh out loud. Riley could see his squinting, sly eyes through the gaps in between his fingers. That's because I've been planning to get you pregnant, so how would things work if I didn't know when exactly your period started? Riley choked on her saliva. So, does that mean that I've won the jackpot? At noon, Louis brought Riley to the hospital for a checkup, and the result of the checkup was that she was pregnant. Chapter 1148. Riley walked out of the ultrasound room while rubbing her abdomen. She was not at all prepared for the sudden addition to the family member who was living in her womb at the moment. I got pregnant before I even got ready to become a mother, but looking back on Louis's various actions in the past few weeks now, he's been telling me that I'm getting fat, but he hasn't been restricting me from eating anything at all. I've not been allowed to stay up late, eat junk food, wear high heels, or even jump around. Don't all these mean that he's noticed this since weeks ago? Louis stood and waited in the corridor. He was about to speak when he saw Riley coming out of the room. Riley stopped him by shoving the smacking his chest with the result. Why didn't you tell me about this earlier? He took the report and looked down at her aggrieved face. Do you not want to have kids? Of course not, Riley replied anxiously. If you had told me about this earlier, I would have started preparing myself since then. And now that I learned I'm pregnant out of the blue before mentally preparing myself for the news, I'm afraid. Louis took her into his arms and stroked her hair. I'm sorry, I've been too selfish. I was afraid that you wouldn't want to keep the baby if you were to know that you were pregnant earlier. He had originally planned to conceal the pregnancy until 3 months later so that she would not be able to have an abortion after the fetus was fully formed. However, he had ignored the fact she would be afraid of conceiving a child. Who told you that I wouldn't want a kid? Riley laughed and cried in Louis's arms. I'm only scared. I'm afraid of the pain. Louis wiped her tears away and kissed her on the top of her head. I'll be there with you throughout the whole process. If you're afraid of the pain, we'll choose to deliver the baby through a C-section. I'll also get you the best medical team to ensure your safety and make you suffer less. Riley was coaxed into a guffaw. I wonder if you do mean it, and I'm only making an assumption here. Just in case I'm going through a difficult childbirth, will you choose to save the mother or the baby? Louis pinched her face with a serious expression. Isn't this a no-brainer? I'll, of course, choose to save you first. We can always conceive another child in the future. But who else can I ask to be my wife if you're gone because of childbirth? Riley chuckled and plunged her head into his arms again. I feel like I didn't get myself a wife through our marriage, but a daughter instead because she cries all day long. What did you just say? Nothing much. Louis wrapped his arm around her and said solemnly, I was saying that we should go home already. At the De Arma mansion. I'm going to be a great-grandfather already? Hernandez learned that Riley was pregnant and was so happy that he could not keep his mouth closed. Oh my, this is really a delightful event. How great is this? I'll actually be able to see the birth of my great-grandson before I kick the bucket. I think my whole life has been completed because of this. Hernandez immediately summoned the servants and asked them to prepare a scrumptious dinner banquet for them. Lewis helped Riley to sit down on the couch as Hernandez stared at him. Take good care of your wife. Pregnancy is the most tiring thing that any woman in the world has to go through. I didn't even dare to make your grandmother do anything when she was pregnant with your mother, as the baby was our top priority throughout the whole journey. Lewis nodded helplessly. I know. You don't have to remind me about that. Hernandez then added with a stern expression, also, don't make your wife angry again. Mental stability is also crucial to any pregnant lady, do you get me? Lewis chuckled. How would I dare to make her angry? Do you know how long it would take for me to coax her every time she cries? Riley glared at him while Lewis rubbed the top of her head as the smile on his face intensified. The continuous heavy rain baptized the capital of the Yarramore. The roses of the St. Donner estate looked even more beautiful when they bloomed during the rainy season. The rain droplets dripped off the eaves and onto the bluestone slabs and flowed into the soil, nourishing the newly grown buds. Nolan and Yorick were sitting behind the curtains, playing chess, while a servant was standing next to their desk, brewing tea. The boiled water was then poured onto the tea leaves, and the fragrance of the tea pervaded the whole room. Yorick looked out the window. The rainy season is here again. This looks bad. Yeah, this weather looks pretty bad. Nolan picked up the teacup and took a tiny sip. It seems that I'll be staying here for a few more days. Chapter 1149. Yorick frowned. You shameless bastard. Is he planning to prolong his stay here and continue to bring more chaos into my life? Nolan put down the teacup, and his expression remained unchanged. Why should I act tactfully when I'm with you? Yorick laughed out of wrath, propped his arms against the edge of the table, and glared at Nolan. Did Maisie take a fancy to you because of your brazenness? Nolan rolled up his sleeves, casually. Then do enlighten me. How many shameless crappy things have you done when you were trying to grab yourself a wife? Yorick was rendered speechless. Standing upstairs, Maisie and Zyla turned around together, and Zyla bumped her arm with her elbow. Are both of them always like this? Maisie turned to look at Zyla. You're just getting to know them. They're both already in their 30s, and yet they act so childishly. Zyla had widened her horizon. Mr. Goldman has always been a regal and prominent man in front of the public. He's never been friendly, and he constantly has an aura that alienates others and that prevents strangers from approaching him. But that doesn't seem to be the case when he's around Yorick, does it? Some might even think that they're a couple, and we ladies are both redundant. Maisie patted Zyla on the shoulder. There's nothing strange about that. Nolan mocks everyone that he's with. It used to be Helios, but Yorick has been turned into his temporary punching bag now that we're in Yarramore. You haven't even gotten the opportunity to be there to witness when he teases his grandfather. Zyla could not help but laugh out loud as she walked back to the room with Maisie. That sounds nice. At least I now know that Mr. Goldman truly loves his wife. Maisie sat down on the end of the bed. Yorick treats you very well too. Zyla walked up to the French window, pulled the curtain open, and stared at the raindrops that dripped onto the glass. He's really treating me like a queen right now. He had never failed to piss me off every second before he confessed his feelings for me. She turned around, glanced at Maisie, and laughed. The feeling of both parties walking toward each other at the same time in a relationship feels so different from the feeling of being the person who's chasing after someone who's walking away from her. I get it now. Maisie got up and walked to the window. That's why you should consider yourself one of those lucky ones. Zyla smiled, looked out the window, and said nothing. The rain gradually stopped, and the originally gloomy sky became much clearer. Maisie and Nolan were about to depart from the mansion. But she remembered something right before they departed and walked up to Zyla. "I have something for you." Zyla was startled. She then lowered her head and took the box that Maisie handed over. "There's even a gift for me?" She opened the box, and there was a ruby ring lying inside, the one that she had endorsed while she was working with Soul Jewelry. Zyla could not help but laugh. "She actually gave me the ring that I endorsed before this." Yorick walked up to her from behind and saw the ring in her hand. "Isn't this the ring that you endorsed back then?" "How do you know that?" Zyla turned around and stared at him, looking a little surprised. Yorick could not help but chuckle. "I've gone through all the products that you've endorsed in the past, and I was very impressed by this ring." Zyla lifted her eyebrows and smiled. "Oh really? Did you go over them on purpose?" Yorick stroked her cheek with his palm. "Maisie has prepared during for you, so shouldn't there be one for me too? This is the only one in the world, and it's meant to be given to me and only me. What makes you think that you'll be getting one too?" Zyla pinched the ring tightly. "Are you sure?" Yorick squinted slightly. He took the ring in Zyla's hand and twisted it gently. The ring separated into two different rings and instantly became a pair of couples' rings. Zyla was shocked. "What is?" Yorick picked up the two rings and chuckled. "Aren't these a couple's rings?" "How did you know?" Zyla had not realized the ring itself consisted of a pair of rings. She had always thought that there was only one ring. Yorick scoffed. Maisie used to be a jewelry designer who worked under Luxella Incorporated, and such two-in-one couples rings were a creative idea that she came up with back then. One of the rings would be named the one while the other one would be named the only. "So you and I will be the one and only when we come together." A car was driving slowly in the city. Nolan asked Maisie about the gift that she had given to Zyla, and Maisie gave off a meaningful grin. "It's a ring." Chapter 1150. Nolan chuckled faintly. "You've already given them rings. Why should I wait?" Maisie approached him and blinked. "Rather than allowing them to order their rings from another jewelry company, why shouldn't I make the first move?" Nolan rubbed the top of her head, and his eyes were filled with affection. "Yes, my wife is always right." At this time, Maisie received a text message on her cell phone. It was from Riley. "Nolan." She called out his name immediately after reading the message and said with a grin, "You're going to be an uncle soon." Nolan hugged her and rested his chin on her forehead. "Nice, and I have another good piece of news for you. Helios has a daughter now." "The baby is born already?" Maisie was surprised and looked up at him. He responded softly as he fiddled with the tips of her hair with his fingertips. "I just received the news." Half a year later, in the late autumn, Nolan and Maisie returned to Basberg after Soul Jewelry's branch in Staslo had stabilized. Barbara had given birth to a daughter a few months ago. Thus, Maisie brought some skincare products to the Boucher Manor to visit her. Looking at all the skincare products that Maisie had brought along with her, which had piled up on a table, Barbara could not help but laugh. "You can just come here empty-handed. There's no need to spend so much money. Why shouldn't I spend some money on your baby? Daisy has been looking forward to your baby as she's finally an older cousin now." Maisie walked to the crib and sat down. The baby sleeping soundly was still chewing on the pacifier in her mouth, and her eyelashes looked exceptionally long, making her look so adorable. Barbara crossed her arms, leaned against the wall, and chuckled. "Riley is already about to catch up to me. Daisy is going to become the older cousin of another little fella very soon. Yeah, she's now 31 weeks pregnant, and she's estimated to be due at the end of the year." Maisie caressed the baby's face gently and smiled. "Don't wake up, Bee. It's very difficult to calm her down as soon as she starts to cry." "Bee?" Maisie raised her head and looked at Barbara. "Have you chosen a name for her?" Barbara nodded. "Helios is the one who chose it. Her name is Beatrice Boucher." "Beatrice," Maisie looked at the baby in the crib and chuckled. "She might even become my daughter-in-law when she grows up." Barbara almost burst into laughter. Stop it. Don't you ever think about turning my Bea into one of the Goldman. She's still so young, and you're already thinking about making her your future daughter-in-law. Who knows? You can't be sure either. Maisie chatted with Barbara for a long time before she decided to leave the Boucher matter. She then ran into Francisco when she came to the courtyard. It had almost been a year since she and Francisco last met each other. After Maisie's incident, Francisco seemed to have become more mature and appealing at first glance, and he was no longer giving off the aura of someone who took things easily all day long. Francisco looked a little surprised and stepped forward when he saw her. Are you here to visit Barbara? Yeah. Maisie looked at him with a wide grin on her face. It's been almost a year since we last met, and you've changed a lot. Francisco paused for a split second, inserted his hands into the pockets of his trench coat, lowered his gaze, and gave off a smile. Probably, humans do change. He had left the youthful aura behind and replaced it with a more mature personality. Perhaps it was not that he had changed, but that his mindset was different from before. I think I still owe you a free meal, it's been so long, and I still haven't lived up to my words. Maisie rubbed her chin. I wouldn't have thought of it if I hadn't seen him today. Maisie invited him to a meal, and Francisco did not reject her, so the two of them went to a restaurant. Are you still working at the law firm? Maisie fetched herself a piece of meat and looked up at him. He picked up the glass and took a sip of water. I've passed the test. I'm now a prosecutor, but I'm still working on getting through the internship.